Somewhere near this spot beneath York Minster, Edwin, King of Northumbria, was baptized on Easter Day 627 AD. But he wasn't alone. Other members of his household also became Christians on that day, and among them was a 13-year-old girl who came to be known as Saint Hilda, or simply Hild. But Hild's early years are shrouded in mystery. A mystery that began right at the beginning of her life, when, as Bede records for us, Hild's mother had a dream of her daughter appearing as a great light. After searching thoroughly, she suddenly found under her dress a most precious necklace. And as she examined it more closely, it seemed to shine with such a blaze of light that it filled all the land of Britain with the beauty of its radiance. There's no doubt that this dream was fulfilled in her daughter.
Bede is our only serious source on Hild. There are one or two other references to her, but nothing else about her. And Bede is not writing a history of England. He's writing a history of the church. So he only becomes interested in Hild when she becomes a religious, which is late in life. Bede Latinizes Hild's name as Hilda, but Hild itself must be a short name, a pet name. Most Anglo-Saxon names are two-syllable. So she may have been a Hildathryth or a Hildalith or a Hildeberg and just been called Hild by friends and family, and it became her name.
Bede tells us quite a lot about Hild's character. He says she was a woman of great energy, which I suppose she must have been to have achieved all she did. He also stresses the fact that she was called Mother, and I find this quite interesting because great spiritual leaders aren't always people who perhaps earn that title. But there must have been a warmth about her, a nurturing quality. And then also he stresses twice that she was wise and that even kings came to ask her advice. So I think she's in the line of the great wise women of history.
She was also, I would have thought, a great ecumenist, and this is something else which I suppose we now think of as being modern. To have the ecumenical movement going on now is seen to be what the church does in the 20th century. But this actually started in Hilda's day, and she was one of the first people who really began to look at the way in which the church should unite, even if it wasn't always to her liking. So, an ecumenist, an innovator, encourager.
We know from Bede that Hild spent the first 33 years in a noble life, in a secular habit, but she gave up this secular life to serve the Lord. It was commonplace for noble women in those days to serve and indeed spend some time in religious houses. She apparently went to East Anglia, intending to visit a sister, but thereupon she gave up all her worldly possessions to become a nun. She went to a very famous monastery near Paris called Chelles. But as with all these things, fate decided to take a hand. Bishop Aidan of Lindisfarne invited her back to the north. He gave her a task. With some land, she was to found a monastery on the banks of the River Wear.
The thing about Hilda was that she represented a new force at that time for two reasons. She had property, she had wealth for various reasons, and she used it for the sake of Christianity. Now, she was way ahead of the men in the royal families. She was probably far more learned than them, could read and write when they couldn't. But by building this great abbey, she trained bishops. She trained 5 bishops. She trained young women. So here she had cohorts of disciples all over what is now England, all over parts of what is now Europe and so on, beholden to her, and she became a great force through herself and through them. And that fascinated me because she wanted to make a mark, and she saw that women couldn't rule through the courts, which were completely warrior-led, but they could through the church. The women, the noble women, saw Christianity as a way to get hold of power and influence, and they were about 150 years ahead of the men in that, of most of the men. And that's why I thought they were both sincere but also very cunning, and it only lasted 150 years or so, and then they were crushed back.
As if to preserve the mystery surrounding Hild, opinion remains divided on whether this Regency Church of St. Hilda's in South Shields could stand on the actual site of Hild's first monastery. But for the generations who have worshipped here, the presence of the saint is a very real experience.
Bede tells us that she was given one hide of land north of the weir. It's sometimes suggested that her first monastery was South Shields because that has a Hild dedication, but South Shields on the Tyne. I consulted the place names experts on this one, and we're inclined to think that there was a settlement on the weir which was subsequently overtaken by Monk Wearmouth.
After only a year at her first monastery, she moved to the double monastery at Hartlepool, or Herod-Tool, as it was called.
The obvious connection is the church we see here today is named after Hild, who of course became a saint after being abbess of the Abbey here at Hartlepool. She came to Hartlepool in the 640s. She was appointed as abbess here by Bishop Aidan, and between them, Aidan and Hilda established a monastery here, which went on for another 100 years after Hilda moved on. One of the great finds of the monastery at Hartlepool, I mean, examples to be seen in the British Museum and up at Newcastle as well as Hartlepool itself, are the namestones. These accompanied burials of the monks and the nuns of the monastery and were found during house building in the 19th century. They're small square stones with a cross inscribed on them and with the name of the person who was buried underneath them placed on them.
Like a beacon against the ignorance and violence of the age, the Northern Church was gradually building centres of learning along the Northumbrian coast. And after 10 years at Hartlepool, Hild was appointed to found another dual monastery down the coast at Whitby.
Hild's monastery at Whitby lies approximately beneath our feet, and there was a very big excavation here in the 1920s which uncovered a large area on this side of the present Abbey. The Abbey church that you can see here today was in fact built starting in the 13th century, and that is the third Abbey church that there's been on this site. There was one before that which was the 12th century refoundation, which is when people came to refound the holy places of the north as described by Bede who had made them famous years before. And then before that one there was Hilda's monastery. Now, because the site has been built on so many times, there isn't actually very much to see above ground of that monastery.
Hild's monastery at Whitby was what's technically called a double monastery. This is a very peculiar kind of institution, which the idea had come actually from Gaul, and indeed Hild herself had trained, or was going to train in Gaul, along with many of her other fellow women aristocrats. The notion came from there. Effectively, these monasteries were set up by some high-born aristocratic lady, but men were needed in order to officiate at the Mass, in order to do various kinds of administrative jobs as well. So you get men and women in the same monastic institution, under an abbess.
These early monasteries in Northumbria were either on real islands, like Lindisfarne, all based on the one in Iona, or on metaphorical islands. Monasticism began in the Middle East, in the desert, where monks would go into the desert for the period of 40 days and 40 nights, like Christ in the wilderness, usually during Lent or Advent, to charge the batteries, to prepare themselves, to purify themselves. So a promontory or an island would be an ideal symbolic place for such a function.
In a rare insight into Hild's character, Bede tells us how she approached the task of running the monastery at Whitby, and carried out her task with energy. She established the discipline of the same monastic rule as in her previous monastery, and there too she taught the strict observance of justice, holiness, and chastity, and all the virtues, but especially peace and charity. And in imitation of the early church, there was no one rich or in need there, for they held all things in common. This rare insight into the character of Hild paints us a picture of a dynamic and forceful woman whose virtues were about to be put to the test. In 664 AD, one of the most important events in the history of the church in this country took place here, at Whitby. King Oswey called for a great meeting of the church, a synod to be held here at Whitby. There'd been tremendous debate within the church over the exact date of Easter. the style of the monk's hair, and other such church matters. And so the battle lines were drawn. On the one side, the Irish or Celtic tradition, with people like Aidan and Cuthbert. On the other, the southern or continental church, backed by the Pope. Oswey wanted a clear decision from this synod, to go one way or the other. Whatever, the outcome would fundamentally change the face of the church in Britain.
To have a clash over the dating of your major festival was obviously seen as being of vital importance. So it was really to resolve that clash of traditions that that conference at Whitby was called.
Bishop Coleman spoke for the Irish side, to which Hild belonged, and the young Wilfrid, who had been taught on Lindisfarne, but influenced by his many travels on the continent, spoke for Rome.
I think the synod was held at Whitby because, whether you like it or not, Whitby is very central to the Britain and the England of that time. It was easily accessible by sea, it was then a good harbour. It wasn't very accessible by road, it still isn't. But then most places like this weren't all that accessible by road, but by sea it was all right. And I think it also impinged on Hilda being here. Because, again, she was royal and she was a holy woman. She was recognised as a great trainer and counsellor and a friend of bishops and of kings. And so to come to the place where Hilda was seen as something which would bind together both church and state. So they came there. So I think Whitby was chosen partly because of its venue, but mainly because of Hilda.
As King Oswey opened the debate, saying that those who served one God ought to have one rule of life, and not differ in the celebration of the heavenly sacraments, since they all hoped for one kingdom in heaven. They ought rather to inquire which was the truer tradition, and all follow it together.
For my story, the Synod of Whitby was vitally significant because I saw it as part of the battle between the Celts and the others. I was on the side, the book is on the side of the Celts. Bega is a Celt, Padrick, the young warrior, British warrior, is a British Celt, and they're fighting for survival. First of all against the Teutonic tribes who come into this part of the world from overseas, and they're very powerful, they're a warrior society, and they try to exterminate the Celts. And secondly against the Roman Church coming back in through the south of England, and they want to crush the Celtic Church. So the Celts are in there fighting for survival. The Synod of Whitby seemed to me to be a dramatic instance of this fight coming head on. And after it, the Celts are on the retreat in the church in all sorts of ways.
It soon became clear that the argument would be settled by the establishment of authority, and whose authority carried the most favour with God. Authority was something King Oswey understood. Coleman followed Oswey's opening remarks. This method of keeping Easter, which I observe, I received from my superiors, who sent me here as bishop, and all our fathers, men beloved of God, are known to have followed the same observance. This very same observance was followed by the blessed evangelist John. Wilfrid responded by quoting Christ's words from Scripture. Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Oswey asked, Is it true that these words were spoken to Peter by the Lord? Coleman said, It is true. King Oswey concluded, He is that keeper of the gate, and I will not contradict him. In case when I come to the gates of the kingdom of heaven, he, who by your testimony holds the keys, should turn away, and there be no one to open for me.
What comes over to me about the Synod of Whitby isn't that Oswey was cynical, but that he was ignorant. When he discovered, and this just shows how far the women were in advance of the men, I was talking about Hilda, when he discovered that St. Peter had the keys to heaven, and that if he didn't switch to the Roman side, St. Peter wouldn't look after him, he gave up the ghost. He'd arrived supporting the Celts, had a Celtic education himself, was obliged to the Celts and so on. But as soon as he discovered, now imagining not knowing that and calling yourself a Christian king, that's the state of Christianity in the hands of even him, i.e. very slender indeed.
The Celtic side had lost the argument. Its followers withdrew to Lindisfarne. Some even went back to Scotland. the Northumbrian Church was once more under the authority of the Universal Church of Rome.
What happened after the Synod effectively was that the church in Northumbria got itself keyed in much more closely to the rest of the country, and particularly to the church as it was organised in Canterbury and in areas further south. Northumbria now was organisationally a part of the great European Mediterranean church.
What must have been the effect upon Hild? She was born into a Celtic world, and yet she was one of the first to be baptized at York into the faith and mysteries of the Roman world by the Pope's own missionary, Paulinus. Later still, she was summoned to a religious life by perhaps the greatest Celtic saint, St. Aidan, and given land by him on which to build a monastery. What turmoils of conscience she went through, we will never know. What we do know is that, unlike her Celtic colleagues, she appears to have accepted the decision of the Synod.
Although Hilda certainly would have preferred to carry on in the Celtic tradition, she had already experienced the Roman way. So again, she was in a very unique position to be the kind of reconciler and the enabler in this. And so in the end, when the vote was cast, it went the Roman way. And of course the vote was cast in an abbey dedicated to St. Peter, whom the Pope saw as his sort of first Pope. So if Peter held the keys of the kingdom of heaven and hell, then it was better to opt for the Roman way than the Celtic way. Hilda accepted it. Some didn't. And certainly the monks of Iona took their bat and ball home and cleared off back to their island.
Perhaps the one character whose story remains forever intertwined with that of Hild's is Cadmon, a simple cowherder who became a great composer of religious and devotional songs.
Bede tells us the story of Cadmon, and he says that Cadmon was a simple lay brother in charge of the cattle. And one night when they were having their supper, passing the harp round, he saw the harp coming to him, and he couldn't sing, and he rushed away to his cattle because he was ashamed. And then Bede describes a vision and a miracle in which someone appeared to him and said, "Cadmon, sing me something." And Cadmon said, "I can't sing." And the voice said, "But you can sing to me." And he immediately produced a poem in praise of God, and it was a poem in English.
Now we must laud the heaven kingdom's keeper, the ordainer's might and his mind's intent, the work of the Father of glory.
Nu wishelen herian he often reaches weard, me otters me achter, and his modia thank, we ok wulder fader,
Lord everlasting,
swahi wonder ye
almighty ruler, afterwards fashioned for mortals the middle earth, the world.
Cadmon is talking about the creation of this world, God's kingdom, if you like, here on earth. And it also refers to God as Lord in the way that he is seen as a king, just about, really. And all that is revealed to Cadmon. It wasn't done through Cadmon's own work ethic to work away and get his O-levels and his degree. It was a case of a sudden revelation in a cowshed. So the revelationary nature of conversion was very important at that period. It was something that was God-given. It was a grace, if you like. And that's how Bede describes it and how Hild must have perceived it.
Hild sees that using their own language to tell the Christian story is a good way of teaching. I don't think Bede sees that in quite the same way.
The Anglo-Saxon poets loved to write riddles and charms. They loved to write metaphors. The sea was called the whale road, and that was their way of thinking. Their intellectual complexity is quite different from the simplicity of their lives.
On the night that Hild died, a nun called Begu was resting here in Hackness at her sister's dormitory, when suddenly she was awakened from her slumbers by the sound of a familiar bell tolling. This bell was used to arouse the company to prayers when one of their number had been summoned from this earth. Opening her eyes, she looked up and thought she saw that the roof had been taken off the house, and this great white light was streaming through. she peered into that light and saw the soul of Hild, escorted by a company of angels, being borne to heaven.
Hackness is very much part of Whitby. It's very easy nowadays to think of monasteries being single places like Riva or Byland or Whitby, but you have to think of a big estate. And so the Whitby monastery might well have covered a great deal of ground between Whitby and Scarborough, and Hackness would have been at one end of it. There's very little of the cell at Hackness that survives. There's one small pillar from an early church, a handful of gravestones, which are very like the Whitby stones. And it really dates from the 7th and 8th century. And the cross which I'm standing next to is perhaps the most important statement about that monastery, because there were nuns here.
The community here feels a really strong link with St Hilda. I suppose basically it's because we're leading the same life, leading a life of worship and service. We were founded here alongside a school dedicated to St Hilda, and so she's always been an inspiration to us as a great educator. I think Hild had a great sense of mission, which is something which, again, the church today is refinding. Like most of the Northern saints, she had this single-mindedness, a real determination that the gospel had got to be proclaimed in England. I see Hild as a role model for women in the church today, because we live in this very interesting time when women are rediscovering their role in the church, not just as priests and deacons, but also, I think, in terms of spiritual advisors, spiritual counsellors. And so surely Hild is an inspiration, because she even counselled kings.
I think Hild wanted to spread the message of Christianity throughout the North, and I think even if she were here today, I think she would be very receptive to new technologies of communication, and she might even surf on the internet, who knows.
Hild has left a kind of legacy of what women were like before the Normans arrived. In the Anglo-Saxon England, women had rights of inheritance, women could lead armies, women had equality, which they didn't have in the High Middle Ages. Hild could therefore run an abbey. She could run a joint community. And it's that kind of newfound equality which we've got in the 20th century for which Hild was a model. I think, too, she was a European. She was looking out not to that spiritual horizon, but to the geographical one, with Europe on the other side of the North Sea. She once wanted to go to Shell, the abbey there, and set up a monastery in Gaul. So she was a European, and that, to some people these days, would also be an aspiration. And the idea of belonging to a universal church was something which Hild perceived in the Synod of Whitby, and that was perhaps why it was held here, rather than a fragmented one, which was either Celtic or Northumbrian or Gaulish.
Outside of the north, very few churches are dedicated to Hild, leaving us very little knowledge of this influential woman. Apart from the writings of Bede, her life remains a bit of a mystery to us. Only fragments of the places where she spent her life remain. And this mystery is further compounded, even over the exact pronunciation of her name. What is clear, however, is that she did exercise considerable influence over some important figures and events of her day. She remains a powerful symbol, even if a somewhat enigmatic person.